I wanted to do a couple of videos on the adverse effects that can show up in meditation practice and some ways to work with this and some things I've learned from working with other people going through these experiences and my own experiences of this. First of all, just wanted to share some thoughts on how I've seen this show up. I don't think this is a definitive list by any means, but these are just some versions of it that I've seen in my work as a therapist and in meditation traditions and other areas. The most simple and the most common one that I've seen teaching many people mindfulness practice is just underlying stress showing up when people begin to relax and sit still. And so this is, often a sign we're overworked and we are perhaps quite stressed in our life, depleted. And as we sit still and start to be with our minds, we see all of this. And ultimately, this can be a really positive thing. We can make changes in our life. We can learn skills to handle these thoughts and feelings. However, it can be quite distressing in the beginning when we don't have any tools or capacity to work with this. And actually, sometimes it's better to actually get up and move around if that's happening, and to practice in movement, or to do short practices and build it up, and to work into that with a skilled teacher. The second one is that we might start to see the pain and distress and emotional and psychological difficulties we're going through when we stop doing all the things we use to distract ourselves from them. So quite related to the first one, but a little bit more sort of clinical symptoms showing up. So really, this can be more extreme. It can be when we have actual mental health disorders or challenges showing up. And they can be exacerbated in some people by these practices, especially through intense practice. And this is why in mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, they give the guidance not to work with people in intense depression. That's more of a, once we've got out of intense depression, a way of maintaining mental health in the long term. And this can be true of anxiety disorders and other areas. Again, it doesn't mean that mindfulness and meditation can't be helpful in those disorders. And actually, I would argue they are essential really to learn to work with our mind and our emotions, the things that show up. But it's just the type of practice we do. We might not want to do intense ongoing retreats and intense practice when we're experiencing those things, because where we're trying to work to use our attention and our skills to build up acceptance and psychological flexibility and the ability to control where we focus and what we do. Actually, if we sit intensely, we might exacerbate some of that, because actually we're building up more resistance and more struggle where we're trying to build acceptance and opening up. And people, often use the physical analogy of exercise for this one. So people often draw the parallels to physical exercise. And actually, sometimes people do this in very shaming ways towards people who are suffering with adverse effects. They'll say, it's like running the wrong way or something like that. Or it's, lifting weights in the wrong way. I don't like that analogy, because it's incredibly shaming if you are a person going through these adverse effects. And actually, I've worked with many people who are practicing really well, if we can use that terminology with meditation, i.e., they're not excessively struggling, straining, they're doing it in quite a balanced way. They are following the guidance and the guidelines about how to do it, and yet they find themselves in these difficulties, often through doing intense practice. And so it's very shaming by the meditation community to be told you're doing it wrong in some way, and I think it's not very compassionate, actually. Especially when you look at meditation traditions and you see these things showing up throughout history, they've always been a part of it. And in the past, maybe they were handled in different ways, like these people would be taken off and put to work in the farm, the monastery farm for a long period of time to kind of ground them, or they would be actually hailed in some traditions. Hallucinations and things like that would be seen as some really important vision. So for us to go, oh, these people are practicing wrong, and it's like running in the wrong way, for me, I find not very compassionate. I think it's more like physical exercise. We can't all be ultra marathon runners. Some of us have injuries, difficulties that don't mean we can't practice exercise. We can certainly benefit from some sort of movement, some sort of exercise, but we might not be able to do the real intensity, or we might have to build up in a very different way, or look at why we're doing it and what we're trying to get out of it. And the analogy from exercise as a comparison is quite apt, that even if you are in quite a really difficult physical place and condition, there's a type of exercise you can find that works. And this is where we see mindfulness practice being applied and adapted to work with all kinds of difficult psychological distressing states. For example, the work in the UK on psychosis, and using mindfulness and acceptance and commitment therapy for that. So, you wouldn't get people experiencing that to go on a long retreat, but you certainly can adapt how you practice to work with those sort of phenomena and to make it supportive. So another one is trauma, the interaction with trauma. Now, this has long been known about, and actually, if you speak to any long-term trauma therapist, they will most likely tell you that intense meditation is probably not a good thing to do if you are in an intense period of PTSD. Now, there are always exceptions, and it always works differently, and there are people who actually recover from PTSD on a trauma retreat, but there is no one size fits all for people and their brains. It's all very different, and we have to be flexible. Just like exercise, we can't prescribe one way of exercising for everyone. We have to adapt and change it. And so sometimes with trauma, the very fact of sitting still and in a way being immobilized activates a lot of the somatic memory of trauma and brings it to the surface. And then if we're not working that through in a relationship, we can come up with some problems. In trauma, there is this phenomenon of somatosensory amplification. So somatosensory amplification, this is where we have our somatic effect, and our attention goes onto it, and a bit like a feedback loop on a microphone, it amplifies, it gets more intense, more attention on it, it gets more intense. And we see this with pain and with other distressing effects, and some people think that potentially this happens with trauma symptoms at times. Perhaps if we can bring in more acceptance and reduce the struggle, we break that cycle. But certainly that's very difficult to do and takes practice and training. So for many people, a difficult thing comes up and then struggle builds up. And if we sit there trying to be with it and push through it, that could really amplify it. And you see this in people who've gone through these retreats, and traumas come up, and even end up having flashbacks of memories they don't even remember, that then repeat over and over again for weeks afterwards. This is an effect that can happen and can intensify PTSD symptoms, and where in acceptance and commitment therapy, there might be more an emphasis of the same skills, but using them in action in life to live our values, not to sit still for hours and hours through distress. And certainly I think something that can be helpful for trauma is to use mindfulness skills, but get up and move and focus on where we are, what we're doing, and drop anchor and ground ourselves, and then engage in the world around us and what we're doing and the tasks and to be focused on what we're doing with our thoughts. They're thinking that can help and support the task rather than trying to be still deeply in a meditative state. Sometimes that can be more effective for people. So often, these things can come up from intensive practice. And certainly I've seen this with a number of people I've worked with, have practiced incredibly diligently, very focused, very committed, with strong willpower, and can really do this for long periods of time, and then can be pushed into this area of adverse effects that are just more intense than they expected. They are bringing up more difficulties and kind of interacting maybe with the trauma physiology of the body and dissociation and those sort of detached, kind of shut down, freeze states that can happen when we have the fight, flight or freeze. We're kind of maybe possibly being pushed into a similar territory. It certainly has a lot of the same characteristics. And even in the DSM, they talked very early on about dissociation that can be caused by meditation versus more a trauma dissociation, and trying to distinguish them, but that they share overlap, that there is some similarity. There's even research on some high-level meditators in one tradition showing that they had symptoms of dissociation and depersonalization. They just didn't give it a negative valence. So for them, it was part of their worldview and their framing to be detached from this sense of self and to have a sense of oneness and unity, and to feel like the world was a bit of a kind of a dream, and they were in a dream state, and that was pleasant for them because they were wanting that and they'd framed it that way. Whereas other people who might be going for improved happiness and calm and peaceful states, practice really hard and intensely, and then get into that territory and maybe haven't been made aware that that might be what's about to happen. And we see this in all the traditions. They have these intense distressing states as part of their maps and their progress. So in Mahasi Sayadaw's progress of insight, in the Theravada tradition, you have stages like knowledge of fear and disillusion, where we see how impermanent everything is around us, and it can trigger quite distressing states that they then move through in that model. But certainly they map them out. And in Tibetan Buddhism, you have the niyams, which are any kind of phenomena that can be anything from visions and psychological distress and somatic issues, and they go into lots of detail there. And in Zen, you have Makyo, which is again kind of any of these psychological anomalies and somatic anomalies, and any kind of change in the sense of reality. And in that tradition, you're told to kind of disregard it and keep going. But actually, sometimes, if you're working from a different worldview and things, it might be quite hard to disregard and keep going. James Austin, a very famous neuroscientist and Zen master, he talked about Makyo as being when the brain's on the edge of the barriers of waking, sleeping and dreaming. And when you're in this state, you can get some auditory aberrations, hallucinations, unusual somatic experiences and the like. And some people call this lucid dreaming whilst you're awake. I learned from traditional teachers in the past who were very good at this and could go into kind of lucid dreaming in a meditative state and be very much in an altered reality, like they were moving through another realm, and they would view it as another realm. That was what they were talking about. But when you explored it and talked about it this way, and Lee Brasington, the meditation teacher, kind of views some of this way as well, that it's lucid dreaming in a waking state. And then you're getting some quite symbolic and bizarre perceptual stuff going on from your unconscious mind that you're engaging with in like a dream. So that these stages and these things are well known about in meditation traditions, and they'll be viewed through the frame of a traditional religious framework in one context, and then brain phenomena in another, and adverse effects in another. And really, we've got to be clear about what our frame is and what we go into this practice looking for. And my own experience of this was after very intense practice. I was practicing all day long. I'd done a number of retreats, and then I was trying to practice all day long outside of retreats, including moving through every part of my life, trying to be mindful in the present, doing different practices, doing non-dual Dzogchen practice and mindfulness practice, and various things, and just doing kind of 24/7 mindfulness. And when I did that, I just had some incredibly intense things that you might view as depersonalization, and very overwhelming panic and anxiety beyond anything I had experienced. And I have a long history of those things. I've had my first panic attack that I remember when I was 6, and I had depersonalization from that age, and I had all kinds of intense stuff, OCD and all kinds of difficult things, which mindfulness had helped me with a lot up until that point. And then this intense practice just pushed me into a realm that was really tricky. In the long term, it became a positive thing because it got me thinking about what I was trying to do with that practice. I was getting more and more detached from my life. I was getting into a kind of almost a monastic way of living, but in the kind of normal phenomenal world. And there was quite a clash there, and I was very distant from my values and things that brought meaning and purpose for me, and relationships and connection, and even just hobbies and enjoyment. I was getting more and more disconnected from that, and having more intense depression, anxiety, depersonalization, OCD, all kinds of stuff came up because of that. And then in experiencing those things, I went, right, okay, I've lost contact with my values. Brought that in, it pushed me more into acceptance and commitment therapy and compassion focused therapy, which for me have been incredibly beneficial to move through that state and to a place where I could practice again, but practice for a very specific reason, to learn and develop certain psychological and attentional skills that are useful for enhancing life and making life more enjoyable, more meaningful, more a connection with my values, more a deepened connection in relationships, and more sense of purpose in life, and more compassion, and all these good things that I had looked for. And so now I have a way of practicing that does all of that, and fits in with a life where there's work, there's family, there's all kinds of other things, and they're much more balanced. And for me, that then kind of ironed out the issues. But these things are complex, and these are just some ideas on this, and from lots of people I've worked with now going through these distressing stages. And I guess the other final thought is just the shame that can be given to people from meditation communities. People can be really told, they're doing something wrong, or it's their fault for some underlying psychological problem, or they're striving or grasping or going for the wrong things. And it's like, well, actually, the whole package is the relief of suffering. So there is a goal in meditation practice, or the, enhancing, positive mind states like compassion, love. There are things that people are aiming for, and then to be told, oh, you're striving too hard, or you're practicing wrong, or something like that. And my own sense from teaching hundreds of people mindfulness is the people I've worked with having adverse effects are practicing just like all the other people. The same kind of, some goals, sometimes doing it in a very relaxed, non-striving way, sometimes getting caught up in striving a little bit, but that's what everyone does. And yet not everyone has these reactions. So to kind of dismiss these people and say, oh, it's, you're doing it wrong, is incredibly shaming, very uncompassionate, and not really the essence of these practices. So I think if you're out there struggling with adverse effects, there are communities online now. There's the work of Willoughby Britton, there's the Cheetah House website. There's loads of good resources there, and lots of people going through this. And I've had a huge number of people contact me around this. So it isn't a small minority of people, although there are a whole range of different things going on here. It's not like everyone is having the same adverse effect or the same experience. But if you've had some difficulties, reach out to someone or a community that understands this, and then start to get some support with it. And then in the next video, I'm going to share just a few key ideas for tools and ways of working with this that could be of help and could support you in moving through this.